This is part one of a four-part Broken Money series based on Alden's Broken Money book. We extracted the big ideas, removed the confusing financial jargon, and created a short four-part series with animated videos. The four-part series answers four questions. Part 1, what is money? Part 2, who creates, controls, and manipulates money? Part 3, how is money created, controlled, and manipulated? Part 4, what's next? What is money? At the Blombos Cave archaeological site in South Africa, archaeologists recently unearthed some mind-bending information about early human societies and the real origins of money. The site is 75,000 years old. Archaeologists found small snail shells which had been carefully crafted into wearable beads, and many experts believe this to be the earliest, proven, form of information storage outside the human brain. They must have been brought to the cave site from the nearest rivers, 20 kilometers east or west on the coast. The shells appear to have been selected for size and deliberately perforated, suggesting they were made into beads at the site or before transport to the cave. Besides enjoying wearing shell beads because they look good, historians show they were also a symbol of status and wealth. If someone had a bunch of beaded shell belts and bracelets, it meant they were wealthy, had good social standing, and had probably done many valuable things for many people, or, at the least, were well connected with other wealthy people who had. Let's put this information into perspective. Most of us only consider money in the context of our immediate lives, the last century, the last 100 years of our current fiat financial system. Fiat is the term used to explain our current money system. Most Western economic textbooks covering the history of money go back about 1,000 years to the Middle Ages, as coins and banks first entered the picture. Some more detailed research might even go back to the beginning of recorded modern human history, about 5,000 years ago, as writing and the first ancient civilizations emerged. Money is older than this, way older. And money, as most of us imagine it, is not a single thing at all. It's many things. It's a shared story we tell ourselves. It's various changing tools and commodities used to represent who owes who what. At the most fundamental level, it's an evolution and extension of human interaction. Human interaction is, at its very core, a series of formal or informal credits and debits to others, and is organized by rituals and rules that are tied to our evolutionary instincts, our earliest religions, and our earliest governing structures. This essay will break down different theories of money and offer a new, more practical way to understand what money really is and how it has evolved over time. Commodity versus credit theories of money. When economists and historians debate the origins and nature of money, they tend to fall into one of two opposing camps: the commodity theory of money or the credit theory of money. Why is this important? These two theories have had a huge impact on how we understand money and how our financial system evolved to become what it is today. Let's use an example to highlight both theories and demonstrate why neither exists without the other. Imagine yourself walking along a quiet beach. You spot a beautiful shell. You are mesmerized by the beauty of the shell, but are soon interrupted by oncoming storm clouds and thunder. You realize you have no shelter for the night and will need some help building something, but you have no tools and no building skills. Shite. But you do have a beautiful shell. According to the commodity theory of money, you offer me the shell directly in exchange for my help. The shell's intrinsic beauty and rarity make it valuable. We both recognize its worth, and I accept it as payment in return for helping you build the shelter. According to the credit theory of money, instead of giving me the shell up front, you promise to give it to me after I've helped you. The shell then becomes a representation of the debt you owe me for my help, an IOU. Once the shelter is built and you hand over the shell, it's not just a beautiful shell, it's a representation of my service, which I can use to claim a favor back in the future from you or from someone else. In both cases, the shell is the same shell, and the shelter is the same shelter. However, why we value the shell and where we place trust changes. Did I build the shelter because we agree on the value of the shell itself, the inherent beauty or the ability to use it for jewelry? Or did I build the shelter because we both value the IOU and trust each other that the shell represents a promise that will be repaid? This is, more or less, what historians and economists are talking about when debating credit versus commodity theories of money. Which came first, and which is a more true representation of money? The reality is that humans are complex, and so is money, arguing that either theory is superior came first, or that we evolved smoothly from one to the other fails to explain money. Maybe I built you the shelter because I like beautiful shells, and because I know you'll be more likely to help me decorate my shelter when I ask you tomorrow. If everybody in our tribe agrees shells are valuable, regardless of whether they're valuable because they have inherent value or because they represent a reusable IOU, then shells can solve a major problem. Maybe I need a boat next week, but the boat builder is not in need of a new shelter, which is my specialty. I can build 5 shelters for others needing them, collect 5 shells, and use those shells to pay for the boat. This is the double coincidence of wants problem. Both commodity and credit money solve this problem. The changing nature of money. Whether gold bars, cocoa beans, or banknotes, the lines between commodity and credit are blurry. Throughout history, humans have used many different variations of commodity and credit systems and many different monies to represent those systems: shells, stones, tobacco, feathers, cocoa. A lot of these forms of money were not durable, easily divisible, or scarce, and as humans improved their tools, they also got better at extracting those different forms of commodities. They all ended up failing as money, except, of course, for gold, or more broadly, precious metals. Gold is durable, it is easily divisible, can be melted and made into coins, and it's hard to extract. Even with improving technologies, we can't increase the supply of gold by more than about 2% per year on a sustained basis. This is wild. So gold won. The unfortunate reality was that because gold was such a great commodity to use as money, it became increasingly controlled by the rulers, nations, and governments who had the strongest military force to do so. The history of money from 1000 BCE to the early 1900s is a story of great empires, rulers, and governments capturing and controlling gold or other precious metals, and abusing that power by manipulating that money supply, often to pay for war. This eventually and always led to collapse, recession, and turmoil. In the early 1900s, we still operated a gold standard, meaning your banknotes could always be redeemed for an equal amount of gold held by the bank. This type of money could be considered a form of commodity money. Although your banknotes were an IOU, they were a direct IOU for a commodity. Since the First World War, we've rapidly moved away from any form of commodity money. Our current fiat financial system is backed by nothing, and the IOUs we hold, banknotes and account balances, are really just an imaginary promise. This is why it's so important to move beyond single theories of money. The unified ledger theory of money. In her Broken Money book, Lynn proposes a more complete theory of money. She acknowledges that both commodity and credit money solve the double coincidence of wants problem, but she goes further to explain that the origins and nature of money are a more complex intermingling of both theories. Most forms of exchange are improved by having an easily transferable unit of account, regardless of whether it's a commodity or an IOU. Both theories address this. Both offer valid perspectives on the origins and nature of money, and both have overlapped and coexisted throughout human history. Proponents of the credit theory of money tend to take their concept too far, often disregarding the importance of commodity money entirely, and generally painting too optimistic of a picture of a society's ability to govern a flexible credit-based ledger at a large scale over long periods of time. So if money isn't a single thing explainable by a single theory, what is it? It's a changing representation of a record of who owes who what, a ledger. The important question then becomes, who controls the record of who owes who what? Who controls the ledger? In full commodity money world, the full record of transactions is maintained by physical possession of the commodity. In the case of using physical gold for transacting, gold is both the money and the ledger. Nature creates the gold, and nature creates the ledger. Humans can trust the gold for its inherent value and rely less on trusting each other. Full commodity money world is great until there's not enough to go around. There's storage, transfer, or divisibility issues, or a single player captures control of the commodity. In a full credit money world, There are just IOUs. We trust each other and trust that the IOUs can be used for future favors and transactions. The ledger is maintained and controlled by all participants who use the IOUs and trust each other. Full credit money world is great with high levels of trust and stability, but when large groups of strangers all start using IOUs, a single player is required to maintain the record of IOUs. Things have historically not ended well when this happens. We live in a world with billions of interconnected people all using IOUs. Our bank balances and banknotes are just IOUs recorded on a series of ledgers, which are all more or less controlled by a single ledger, the Federal Reserve. We'll go more into the depth on creation and control of the ledger in the next essay. For the remainder of this essay, we'll explore how money and ledgers became increasingly controlled. Hawaladars and the evolution of banking. Over 1,000 years ago, Arab and Indian trade routes were bustling and vibrant marketplaces with innovative financial networks and technologies. The Hawala financial network was a decentralized, trust-based system which allowed for international money transfers cross-border without formal banks. People would provide money and a password to a local Hawaladar, who would then communicate with a fellow Hawaladar in the recipient's location. The recipient using the password could then collect the money. The system still exists today, though heavily regulated due to concerns of anonymous and illicit fund transfer. Much like money, banking is not a single thing with a clear starting point or linear progression. There are many examples of this. Other financial innovations from the Islamic world over 1,000 years ago, or even grain banks in Mesopotamia over 5,000 years ago, are much older incarnations of banking. Banking, in a broad sense, is way older than most people think. It is an ever-changing and evolving set of innovations which allow for a more efficient transfer of money and record of who owes who what. Modern banking as we know it today is the result of one of these innovations in particular. Double-entry bookkeeping and modern banking. About 500 years ago, we discovered double-entry bookkeeping. Double-entry bookkeeping takes every transaction and splits it into two parts. Imagine everyone having two buckets, one for what they own, assets, and one for what they owe, liabilities. Whenever there is a transaction, one side gets a debit, increase, and the other side gets a credit, decrease. This might sound simple, but this is the big innovation that created the foundations for modern banking. When you swipe your card to pay for your morning coffee, it seems as though your $5 is simply being whisked away to the account of your local barista. But there's more to the story. Behind the scenes, every transaction is split into two parts. When you buy the coffee, one side of your account gets a $5 debit because money is leaving, and the other side gets a $5 credit to record the expense. Simultaneously, the coffee shop's bank gets a $5 credit on one side and a $5 debit on the other. It's important to clarify that a debit doesn't always mean an increase, and a credit doesn't always mean a decrease. It depends on the type of account and transaction, but the important takeaway is that every transaction you make, give or receive, has an effect in both buckets. By recording all transactions into these two separate buckets, a single entity like a bank can now separate transactions from settlement, abstraction. Abstraction is a super important concept that we'll explain and return to many times in this series. You can pay for your coffee, the barista can order more beans, and all of these transactions can happen instantly. Behind the scenes, banks can then square everything up later by ensuring total credits equal total debits. This is great news for your morning coffee routine. But as you might have guessed, abstraction, banking, and the innovation of double-entry bookkeeping is a double-edged sword. Free banking and central banking. Back to the question, who controls the ledger? Thanks to these new innovations in banking, we can all transact more frequently and freely using IOUs without having to physically move the underlying gold. In a free banking system, local banks hold a base money, like gold, and hand out IOUs to depositors to represent their ownership of that gold in the form of banknotes or balances. Ideally, those banks would maintain an equal amount of gold, so that if all depositors came at once to retrieve their gold, they could do so. But unfortunately, they don't. Most banks, even in a free banking system, only maintain a smaller amount of everyone's gold and use the surplus to profit by lending it out to others and charging interest on the repayments. This is fractional reserve banking. Who controls the ledger in free and fractional reserve banking? In this scenario, both local commercial banks and nature control the ledger. As gold is still used as a fractional base, nature still has some control of the ledger. In contrast, in a central banking system, a government establishes a central bank, and that central bank takes complete control of the ledger. The bank owns the base asset, gold for example, standardizes the IOUs that are to be used, and all the local commercial banks use the central bank's ledger and no longer interact directly with the base asset. In extreme cases of central banking systems, governments have outlawed the ownership of the backing asset, like gold, and stripped control of the ledger completely out of the hands of the users and nature. This is us now, yay. Continual abstraction and abuse of the ledger, abandoning the gold standard. So now we know that money is an ever-changing representation of the record of who owes who what, the ledger. And we know banking is a series of innovations which improves our ability to transact and maintain that record. Banking innovations like double-entry bookkeeping paired with technologies like telecommunication, i.e. the telephone, have allowed transactions to happen instantly and be separated from underlying settlement. The more and more efficient the global banking system became at hiding the wires, abstraction, the easier transacting with each other became, and the less people cared about how it worked. Thanks to this continual abstraction and the fact that everyone relies on the single ledger and not gold, central banks under government instruction had the power to entirely remove gold backing the ledger. And in the early 1900s, this is exactly what they did. Before the First World War, the Bank of England had become the centre of the financial universe. It was the most powerful banking institution in the world. Depositors trusted the central bank and commercial banks, and it made sense for them to store their gold somewhere and then transact using banknotes and checks. The promise was that the notes would always be redeemable for an equal and fixed amount of gold. This was a free banking system under the gold standard. But then World War I happened. The government needed money to pay for war, but they couldn't raise enough from the public. So, to fund its war efforts, the government forced people to hand over their gold, revoked their promise to redeem gold, and eventually abandoned the gold standard altogether. By controlling the ledger and removing any ability to redeem a base money controlled by nature, the government could instruct the central bank to create magic money out of thin air and use this to finance war. The paradox of abstraction and the second law of thermodynamics, increasing improvements in banking and centralization of the ledger, have allowed us to transact globally with more freedom. The paradox is these improvements are exactly what have allowed governments and central banks to finance war and conflict, create a shit ton of debt, and leave us with an incredibly unstable financial system. During the 20th and 21st centuries, nation-states with complete ownership of the ledger have used this power to implement widespread control and coordination. Some good things can happen through nation-states controlling the ledger. Economic stability, infrastructure, financial aid and relief, and public goods funding through taxation. But at what cost? The list of consequences of allowing a small number of entities to control and maintain the ledger has been growing for a century, and some argue we're now at breaking point. The second law of thermodynamics, in simple terms, says that in any energy exchange or transformation, the total amount of disorder or entropy in a system will always increase over time. Some people argue that had we never left the gold standard and allowed nature to maintain some control over the ledger, we wouldn't be in this position. Lynn, in her book, has a different take. If we were to run this period of human development back 100 times, I think almost every time we would end up in a similar place in terms of money. Regardless of how or if we think things could have been handled better, we now have a major issue to deal with. Rather than nature controlling the record of transactions or a group of people trusting each other, we have a very small number of entities who control a single ledger in an extremely low-trust environment. They control the ledger, and they decide how money should be created and manipulated. The goals and objectives of those who control the ledger are not the same as the rest of us who rely on the ledger and money to survive and interact with each other. The next essays will explore who those entities are, how they control the ledger and money, and some potential alternatives. If you'd like these essays and animated videos delivered straight to your inbox each week, please visit the website at prometheans.com and subscribe.